Okay. We'll start with icebreakers. What is your name?
God said I need somebody willing to sit up all night with a newborn colt and watch it die, then dry his eyes and say maybe next year. Who planting time and harvest season will finish his 40-hour week by Tuesday noon and then painting from tractor back put in another 72 hours. So God made a farmer. Somebody who'd bail a family together with the soft, strong bonds of sharing. Who would laugh and then sigh and then reply with smiling eyes when his son says that he wants to spend his life doing what Dad does. So God made a farmer.
Is there anything at all rewarding about it?
My parents will tell you no.
This is Little T. She turned 9 years old in 2019. That's 3,285 days overdue. Broilers are slaughtered within 47 days after hatching. In this time span, broilers would have traveled only twice in their lifetime, as day-old chicks to a rearing farm and to the slaughterhouse. They will have been sprayed with immunized vaccines to avoid fowl cholera and other avian diseases, which is not always preventable when considering the speed at which broilers are produced. The chicks are then placed in rearing farms upon arrival, some dead from the exhaustion of their circumstances, some injured from ill handling, some experiencing bacterial infections like dermatitis, and some with genetic non-disjunction. Along with common failed prenatal care, there is an average of 10,000 to 20,000 broilers within a single house, creating a breeding ground for strains of salmonella or cholera that can absorb into the soil and even the atmosphere, tainting the house and surrounding ecosystems, rendering them a biosecurity breach that can hold for months. The farmer is always penalized under these circumstances despite the disease conjuring within corporate hatcheries and not his farm, because he often cannot protect himself legally. These diseased broilers are removed by cervical dislocation by their contracted farmer, who then misses the expected flock yield addressed on their contract, who loses income as a result, who is yet still required to finance facility upgrades while living beneath the poverty line in order to maintain his contract so as not to get terminated from working under the corporation. There is no legally contracted reimbursement for farmers from corporations in any scenario, in death, sickness, or blindness. Candace Thomason is an example of this.
It's one of those things, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. The chemicals that they were using, the other lady was using it on the wash rags, and I got it on my hands, and I didn't know what it was. She told me, oh, it's some soap I found. And it was the newer disinfectants that they use in the cool rooms and in the gathering room to keep pathogens down. And I got it in my eyes. And the gas vapor from just one of the chemicals that was in that mix was enough to blind you. And the reason that I had the blood blisters on my eyes was that the damage was already done. If they had just practiced proper biosecurity and not introduced the pathogen to begin with, and the chicken company is the one that pays for all of the medication, so it is in their best interest to not. But then it's the farmer waiting around in the nasty mess with the half-rotten chickens and burning carcasses and fowls and when it goes wrong.
Let's discuss the corporations. Only 4 meat packers or processing corporations control between 55 and 60% of the entire poultry industry alone. Because the bulk of economic success is localized within the higher tiers of the corporation, not much trickles down to the main producers, farmers. The Big Four intend on maintaining complete control over chosen reformations to ultimately protect their prices for the consumer and maintain the integrity of their national standing. For now, only one recent reform will be focused on that adequately ties all discourse communities together into a coherent and common goal: poultry industry reform. As evidence of this, in 2009, President Barack Obama passed a series of GIPSA reforms to eradicate the tournament system, a tactic by corporations to pit poultry farmers against one another in fear of losing their contracts to competition, so their flock yields are faster, larger, and more productive. Geographically, this reform inspired fair competition in small areas ruled by one meat packer and would have allowed farmers to hold agribusinesses accountable for practices like retaliation, cancellation of contracts, or collusion efforts to force trouble farmers out of the market. It also would have slowed broiler growth rates and supplied healthier birds, defining a reform farm families like Candace's yearned for.
Guaranteed flocks. Guaranteed flocks for years, not just 1 year or 2 years.
Unfortunately, the Big Four meat packers, USDA, and the National Chicken Council rolled back GIPSA protection from the tournament system in 2017, as per President Donald Trump's instruction, countering that adopting the reforms would have made it easier for farmers to sue meat packers for anti-competitive behavior and invited frivolous and costly litigation, resulting in higher prices of product for consumers that couldn't afford it. The National Chicken Council also mentioned that slower growing broilers as a result of tempered tournament competition would require the industry 1.5 billion more broilers slaughtered to sustain the national levels, with an additional 7.6 million acres to grow the feed for the broilers, and 28.5 billion pounds of manure as a result, affecting the already suffering environment surrounding kill lots. What farm aid petitioners don't know is that the overall reform would cost the poultry industry $9 billion to adapt, causing a notable financial impact on food chains, meat packers, consumers, and ultimately farmers, raising their liability. Despite the NCC's opposition of the current GIPSA reform, it is providing funding for research in this area in order to improve upon what they see as an almost steadily reliable production system that must place broiler health at the top. Organizations like Farm Aid are suing for the opaque rollbacks, finding them unjustified and inflexible towards farm families. Farm Aid represents farm families and helps them in avoiding tournament system contracts, raising charities for relief efforts, providing an emergency hotline, and clearing debts. Farm Aid is now working to provide legal relief for farming families in the flurry of rollbacks. Mercy for Animals, an animal cruelty investigation unit, feels a similar anger towards the rollback of GIPSA regarding broiler health concerns, noting that the manipulation of physiological age in feed supplementation is inhumane to broilers because it renders them often unable to walk due to genetic distortions. Mercy for Animals also petitioned for poultry to be included under the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, which was also denied by the Trump administration's USDA around the same time as the GIPSA rollback. Mercy for Animals is currently trying to overturn both failed bills. The USDA GIPSA rollbacks have exposed many of the same ideals shared by these discourse communities, illustrating pattern motives for reform of the poultry industry that simply differ in execution. They each require a balance that benefits themselves and their ideal, but they fail to account for the consequences of their decisions when other communities are parried with it. What is often at the forefront of discussion is the cost of reforms and the effect on the consumer, or in this case, the secondary audience. A junction between morality and money will always plague the conversation between discourse communities, but that does not mean an understanding of cause and effect cannot be put in place between primary audiences of this discourse. The ability, for instance, of the National Chicken Council to welcome rural and corporate opinion on reforms and act in accordance with what is the best decision for all is the pinnacle of what the poultry industry must strive for if it wants to develop. Additionally, secondary audiences must be groomed for this process as well if national changes are to take place. If anything, educating the secondary audience through the product should be a primary goal if the consumer is the primary decider in the reforms. It only makes sense. In fact, unknowingly, these discourse communities, despite their strong opposition for one another, managed to cause the USDA to reopen the discussion on GIPSA for the 2019 year. If and only if these discourse communities can find common ground amongst their exigencies, GIPSA very well may pass again and remain.